Hello. Today's story is one that some of us are familiar with, at least part of the story, and that's Snow White. This particular story is called Snow White and Rose Red. Now that's the part that you might not be familiar with. This was actually compiled by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, and that would have been back in the 1500s. Once upon a time, there was a poor widow who lived with her two daughters in a cottage at the edge of the woods. Two graceful rose trees grew in the garden in front of the house. One tree bore snow white blossoms, and the other bore red ones. The widow's two daughters were as pretty as the rose trees, so she named them Snow White and Rose Red. And they were the sweetest and best children in the world, always diligent and always cheerful. Snow White was quieter and gentler than Rose Red. While Rose Red loved to run about the fields and meadows and to pick flowers and catch butterflies, Snow White stayed at home with her mother and helped her with the housework or read aloud to her when there was no work to be done. The two sisters loved each other so dearly that they always walked hand in hand whenever they went out together. And when Snow White said, "We will never desert one another," Rose Red would answer, "No, not as long as we shall live." And their mother would add, "Whatever one gets, she shall share with the other." The sisters often roamed about the woods, gathering berries, and none of the animals there tried to hurt them. On the contrary, they would come up to the two girls trustingly. Little hares would nibble cabbage leaves from their hands, fawns would graze beside them, and stags would bound past them merrily. And birds in the trees would sing to them with all their might. No evil ever befell them, and if they tarried late in the forest and night overtook them, they lay down together on the moss and slept till morning. Their mother knew that they were quite safe and never felt anxious about them. You think your mom would be all right if you went missing one night in the forest? Once, after they slept all night in the woods and had been awakened by the morning sun, they were surprised to see a beautiful child standing there in shining white robes, sitting very close to their resting place. The figure got up, looked at them kindly, but said nothing, and then vanished into the forest. When they looked around, they saw that they had slept quite close to the edge of a cliff, over which they would have certainly fallen had they gone but a few steps further in the darkness. When they told their mother of their adventure, she said that what they must have seen was one of the fae that guards good children. Snow White and Rose Red kept their mother's cottage so beautifully clean and neat that it was a pleasure to go in. In the summer, Rose Red looked after the house, and every morning before her mother awoke, she placed a vase of red and white roses, some from each tree, on the table by the bed. In winter, Snow White lit the fire in the stove and put on the tea kettle, which was made of brass, but so beautifully polished that it shone like gold. In the evening, when the snowflakes fell, their mother would say, "Snow White, go close the shutters." Then all three of them would draw around the fire, and their mother would put on her spectacles and read aloud from a big book, while the two girls sat spinning wool and listening. Before them lay a lamb, and behind them perched a little white dove with its head tucked under its wing. One evening, as they sat thus cozily together, someone knocked at the door as though he wanted to be let in. Their mother said, "Rose Red, Open the door quickly. It must be some poor traveler seeking shelter." Rose Red hastened to unbar the door and thought she saw a man standing in the cold and darkness outside. Then she saw that it was not a man, but a big, shaggy bear, who thrust his head through the doorway. Rose Red screamed and sprang back in terror. The lamb began to bleat, the dove flapped its wings, and Snow White ran and hid behind her mother's bed. But the bear began to speak, and he said, "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. I'm half frozen and only wish to warm myself a little." "You poor thing," said the girl's mother. "Come in and lie down by the fire. Just be careful not to burn your fur." Then she called out, "Snow White and Rose Red, come out. The bear will do you no harm. He is a good and friendly creature." So they both came out of their hiding places, and gradually the lamb and dove drew near too, and they all forgot about their fears. The bear asked the children to beat out the snow from his fur a little, and they fetched a brush and some cloths, and they rubbed him until he was dry. Then the bear stretched himself out in front of the fire and grunted happily and comfortably. Snow White and Rose Red soon grew quite at ease with him, and even dared to tease their guest a little playfully. They tugged his fur with their hands, put their small feet on his back, and rolled him about here and there. Sometimes they even took a hazel switch and pretended to beat him with it. The bear submitted to everything with the best possible good nature. Only when they went a little too far, he cried, "Spare my life, Snow White, Rose Red. He who is dead can never wed." When it was time to retire for the night, the two girls had gone to bed. Their mother said to the bear, "You can stay and sleep here on the hearth with God's blessing, and it will shelter you from the cold and the wet." And so he did. But as soon as the day dawned, Snow White and Rose Red let him out, and he trotted away over the snow and into the forest. From this time on, all winter long, the bear came every evening at the same hour. He lay down at the hearth and let the girls play what pranks they liked with him, and they soon grew so accustomed that the door was never locked until their shaggy friend had made his appearance. One morning, when spring had come and all was green outside, the bear said to Snow White, "Now I must go away. I will not be able to come back all summer long." "Where are you going, dear bear?" asked Snow White. "I must go into the forest to protect my treasure from the wicked gnomes. In winter they have to stay in their underground caves, for they can't work their way through the frozen earth. But now, when the sun has thawed and warmed the ground, they break through and come up above to wander around and steal whatever they can. What falls into their hands and into their caves is not easily brought back." Snow White and Rose Red were sad that their friend had to leave, but they unbarred the door, and the bear stepped out. As he did, he caught and tore a piece of his fur on the door latch, and Snow White thought she glimpsed a glitter of gold at that very spot, but she couldn't be certain of it. The bear ran hastily away and soon disappeared beyond some trees. What do you suppose? Did the bear have gold? Was the bear made out of gold? Well, let's see. A short time afterwards, Snow White and Rose Red's mother sent her daughters into the forest to gather some kindling wood. And as they wandered, they came upon a big tree that had fallen on the ground. On the trunk, half hidden by the tall grass, they noticed something jumping up and down, but they couldn't make out what it was. And when they had come nearer, they saw that it was a gnome, a tiny man with a wrinkled face and a white beard at least a yard long. The end of his beard was wedged into the cleft of the tree, and the little man sprang about like a dog on a chain trying to free himself. He glared at the girls with fiery red eyes and shouted, "Why are you just standing there like that? Can't you come here and help me?" "What happened to you? What were you doing?" asked Rose Red. "You stupid, snoopy goose," cried the gnome. "I wanted to split the tree to get some little chips of wood for our kitchen fire. The thick logs that serve to make fires for coarse, greedy people like yourselves burn up the dainty little food that we need. I had driven the wedge in nicely, and all was going well, but the wood was so slippery that the wedge suddenly sprang out, and the tree closed up so quickly I had no time to take my beautiful white beard out. So here I am, stuck fast, and I can't get away. You silly moon-faced girls, just stand there and laugh. Ugh, what fools you are." Snow White and Rose Red tried to help him, but they couldn't get his beard out. It was wedged too far, too firmly. "I will run and fetch someone to help," said Rose Red. "Crazy idiots," snapped the gnome. "What's the use of calling someone else? You're already too many for me. Can't you think of anything better than that?" "Please don't be so impatient," said Snow White. "I'll help you get loose." And taking her scissors out of her pocket, she cut the end of his beard off. As soon as the gnome felt himself free, he seized a bag full of gold that was hidden among the roots of the tree, lifted it up and shouted, "Look what you have done! You've ruined my splendid beard." And with these words, he swung the bag over his shoulder and disappeared without so much as looking at the two girls again. A few days later, Snow White and Rose Red went out to catch some fish for supper. As they came near the stream, they saw something that looked like an enormous grasshopper springing toward the water as if it was going to jump in. They ran forward and recognized the cranky old gnome. "Where are you going?" asked Rose Red. "Surely you're not going to jump in the water." "I am not such a fool," screamed the gnome. "Don't you see that the big fish is trying to drag me in?" The little man had been sitting on the bank fishing, when unfortunately the wind had tangled his beard in the fishing line, and when a big fish bit the hook, the feeble little man hadn't the strength to pull it out. Instead, the fish, who was the stronger, dragged the gnome toward him. The angry little man clutched with all of his might to every reed and blade of grass, but that didn't help much. The fish pulled him closer and closer to the edge of the stream. The girls came up just at the right moment. They held him tightly and tried to untangle his beard from the fish line, but all their efforts were in vain, for beard and line were in a hopeless muddle. There was nothing else to do but take out the scissors again and cut off another small part of the gnome's beard. When he was finally set free, the ungrateful creature yelled rudely at the two sisters, "Do you call that polite, you toadstools, to disfigure a person's face? It wasn't enough that you shortened my beard before, but now you have cut off the best bit of it. I can't be seen looking like this before my own people. I wish you had never come by." Then he picked up a sack of pearls that lay among the reeds, dragged it away, and disappeared behind a stone. Now it happened that soon after that, their mother had sent Snow White and Rose Red to town to buy some needles, laces, and ribbons. The road led through a meadow where huge boulders lay scattered here and there. While they trudged along, the two girls saw an eagle hovering in the air above them, circling lower and lower until at last it settled on a rock not far from them. Immediately afterwards, they heard a sharp, piercing cry. They ran forward and saw in horror that the huge bird had pounced on their old acquaintance, the gnome, and was about to carry him off in her claws. The tender-hearted children seized a hold of the little man and struggled with the bird so long that at last it let go. But as soon as the gnome had recovered from the shock and found that he was safe again, he screeched, "Couldn't you have treated me more carefully? You have torn my poor coat all to shreds. What useless, awkward creatures you are!" And then he picked up a bag of precious jewels and vanished under the rocks into his cave. Well, by now, the girls were used to his ingratitude, so they went on their way to town. On their way home, as they again were crossing the meadow, they surprised the gnome as he was pouring out his precious jewels and admiring them. The evening sun shone on the glittering gems. They gleamed so beautifully that the children stood still and gazed at them. "What are you standing there gaping for?" screamed the gnome, and his pale, wrinkled face became scarlet with rage. He was about to go off with these angry words when a sudden growl was heard, and the black bear trotted out of the forest. The gnome jumped up in great fright, but he hadn't time to scurry away to his hiding place, for the bear was already close to him. And then he cried in terror, "Dear Mr. Bear, please spare me. I'll give you all my treasure. Look at those beautiful jewels lying there. Spare my life. What pleasure would you get from eating a poor skinny little fellow like me? You wouldn't even feel me between your teeth. There, take those two wicked girls. They'll be right tender morsels for you, and they're as fat as young quails. Eat them up, for goodness sake." But the bear, paying no attention to these words, gave the evil gnome one blow with his paw, and he never moved again. The girls started to run away, but the bear called after them, "Snow White, Rose Red, don't be afraid. Wait, and I'll come with you." And they recognized his voice and stood still, and when the bear was quite close to them, his furry hide suddenly fell off. A handsome fellow stood beside them, all dressed in gold. "I am a king's son," he said, "and I have been under a spell cast by that wicked little gnome. He has stolen my treasure and turned me into a wild bear to roam about the woods until his death could set me free. Now he has gotten his punishment that he deserved." A few years later, Snow White married the king's son, and Rose Red married his brother, who was also a handsome prince. They divided between them the great treasure that the gnome had collected in his cave. Their old mother grew and lived peacefully in the palace with their two daughters for many years. She brought her 2 rose trees with her, and they grew in front of her window, and every year they bore her the finest roses, both white and red. And that's the end of the story. And it's absolutely true, if you choose to believe it so.